the company. So just so no one gets confused. Right, so starting off with the human bias problem. So we all know that humans are biased, but I just want to highlight from the psychology perspective, this isn't necessarily something that you can find out by talking to someone. So if you have a conversation with them and they say, oh, I think that this and this and this, that's not their biases. Those are their opinions. And we distinguish that from biases and call this the explicit attitudes, which are conscious, which are different from what we mean by bias, which are implicit attitudes. And I just want to give two quick examples so that we can distinguish these very clearly. One of my explicit attitudes, for example, is I think that jellyfish are really scary. And I have a story with this. I have an experience why this is, because when I was 4 years old, my mom lifted me into the waves in the ocean and I got hit by a jellyfish and it hurt really bad. So this is an opinion that I have that I can reason about, and it's an explicit attitude, which is different from the implicit attitudes that many of us have. So for example, if you are in your garden and the butterfly lands on your hand, you might go, oh, look how pretty, right? Whereas if a bug crawls over your hand, you're very likely to shake it off and go, oh, there was a bug, right? Those are implicit attitudes that we have about butterflies and bugs, and they have nothing to do with them on the face values. They're both insects. They both can look very pretty, as we can see in the pictures. But we have been conditioned to think that way about bugs, either because we've seen them in cartoons being the little nasty crawlers, or because we saw other people shake them off and talked about them as being disgusting. Now, why do I mention this? It's because these two aren't necessarily connected. So just because you can talk to someone and you think that their political opinions are great and they're not necessarily misogynistic or racist, doesn't mean that they don't have implicit biases about these certain groups that kind of come unconsciously as a little gut feeling. So the good thing here is we have developed implicit bias testings. There's a little link here if you want to check out all your implicit biases about different topics. But B, we've also developed unconscious bias trainings that are supposed to train these biases away. That's great. Unfortunately, they don't work because implicit attitudes are developed over a very long time and they're not going to go away with a one-off unconscious bias training. Now, we have this problem. Maybe AI can help. Let's see. So the overall promise that is usually sold with AI is, hey, tell us about your awesome employees. We have an algorithm that will learn what makes your employees great, and we will help you hire great people in the future. And since we're dealing with numbers and algorithms, hey, it's a machine. It doesn't have implicit attitudes, right? Well, let's see about that. So this is a quick overview of a lot of the proposed applications of AI in hiring that are out there currently. They're all advertised by companies, and most of them are advertised as not only helping reduce time in hiring, but also reducing bias. And I've separated them into 3 categories. So we have the application stage that is for connecting applicants to employers, the screening stage that happens kind of behind the walls of the employer, screening through CVs, and then the interview stage, which is the actual connection stage between a potential employee, between applicants and employers. And so those are all out there. I'm going to go into a couple of them and maybe draw up some misconceptions around those applications. So AI bias. We have this misconception that is often said that, hey, don't worry, there's no bias because our algorithm doesn't take protected attributes into consideration. What are protected attributes? Those are the things like sex, gender, maybe disability status that are often you're legally not allowed to discriminate upon, right? So let's say this is my CV. It's a toy example. And let's say that I apply to a company and they say, hey, we don't take protected attributes into consideration because from your name, maybe we would know that, hey, Fiona, that sounds like you might identify as a woman. And then Melzer, oh, well, maybe you're not Finnish, maybe you're not English, right? So we have this great algorithm. We're not taking into consideration all of that. Now, the problem is that this is my CV. And even if you take out my name, it's still my CV. It still represents my experience. So you will see that I went to high school somewhere, but to university somewhere else, which will tell you about the fact that I might be an international student. Or under awards, I might have won a women's scholarship. And these certain sort of things will still tell you that I'm a woman, that might be international, right? So these things aren't necessarily separable. And that's the same thing in a CV as in an Excel data sheet. Different subparts of a person experience are inseparable. They correlate with each other, and an algorithm as well as a human hirer will still see that. Now, another misconception is AI isn't biased. So if we use it in hiring, we can help you make your team more diverse. And let's go with this example that you have a team, this is your team, and you think they have really great skills. So you want to hire more people that have these really great skills in the future. So you feed your team's CVs as a data set, as an input into an algorithm. And this algorithm, this is a neural network, a machine learning algorithm, will learn from those CVs what makes your employees great, and then will help you when you feed it new CVs to tell you, hey, these applicants don't really, they don't look like your employees, but this one, hey, I think that one matches, right? Now, that is great if you already have a really, really diverse company and you just want to upkeep that diverse standards and hire similar people. This doesn't work if your team and the data that you feed in is not diverse, because what you're doing in this case is you're telling the algorithm, here, this, my data, that's the ideal, learn from it. And there is nothing in the algorithm that will know that you mean learn the skills, but not all the other things in their experience that are correlated with who they are. So if you have a predominantly white male team to begin with, then your algorithm isn't going to give you a diverse team at the end of it. And this is unfortunately not just a toy example, but as Vaishali mentioned, Amazon has developed an algorithm that was doing just that. It was filtering CVs, hoping to gain skillful applicants. And in the end, it turned out that the algorithm was filtering out any CV that had the word woman in it and applicants that went to specific all women's colleges that are a thing in the US. And this is not really a surprise because the data that they fed in was of their previous employees, and this is their employee cut between men and women in the senior leader level. So these things unfortunately happen. Now, I'm going to go with one last word of warning, which is beware of mind reading AI. There is some companies out there that promise they have an AI system that can analyze video and or sound files and can detect from there an applicant's emotion and or personality traits during an interview. And I just want to make very clear that from a psychological perspective, this claim has no scientific foundation. The claim that emotions cause a certain facial configuration that we can see and recognize isn't supported by psychology, because one facial configuration isn't just used for one emotion, and one emotion can cause different facial configurations. And even then, configurations aren't necessarily the same across different people or even across populations. So psychology says no. And then another one, even if there was a scientific foundation, facial recognition and natural language processing are currently heavily biased against non-white people and people with a non-standard accent of mostly English, but even for other languages that algorithms are trained for, they discriminate against non-standard accents. If you want to know more about that, I recommend watching the Coded Bias documentary. And also, I have linked an article down below that explains the psychological kind of taking apart of this so-called emotion AI and its application in hiring, if you're more interested to hear more about this. Now, the outlook. What do we do with all of this? Well, I wish I could tell you, here's our silver spoon. This is the one algorithm that does it all right and that will save you all the time and give you all the diverse teams that you need and want. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you that. I can tell you, though, how you can navigate the space maybe a little bit. So for the human bias part, experiments have shown that with time and motivation, we're able to move people from these unconscious, instinctive, and most probably biased attitudes or also gut feelings to the more explicit attitudes that in most people, unless they're openly misogynistic or bigoted, are not as biased, right? So giving people who go through CVs and who go through applicants a specific set of time per applicant rather than an overall time period to go through as many applicants as possible, and giving them a motivation to be thorough, such as them needing to give recommendations or reasons why they rejected or put through the next stage an applicant, will already help going from the unconscious bias perspective to the more skill-focused part. Now, on the AI bias, there is a place for AI systems in hiring. I don't want to demonize it all, but we have to be very careful where we put it. We have to remember what AI systems are good at. And just to give the overview, they're good at processing large amounts of data that humans can process in that way. They might be really good at traversing the internet for certain keywords. So what we might be able to use AI systems for are, for example, chatbots that kind of serve as a little bit of an interactive Q&A for potential applicants to ask questions about the job, or for sourcing applicants from different application portals by looking up certain keywords and their synonyms. These sort of things AI systems are good at. They can't do magic. They're not really good at reasoning. If you can't tell by looking at a lot of pictures of people whether or not they quit their previous job or they were fired, the algorithm probably can't do that either. So don't rely on magic, please. And then lastly, always look at the data, look at your own data, look at the proportions of the data, the population breakdown of the data. And if you are thinking of using a third-party algorithm that is providing their data already, then request to see their data and really look at the population breakdown. And then to give a little bit of an overall recommendation, remain accountable. If you're using an AI system, you need to know why you hired or rejected a certain person. Even if the AI doesn't make all the decision, but is somewhere in the decision tree, you need to know how that affects an applicant's chance to be considered or not. And then a little bit of a personal professional recommendation from me is do an ethics audit of your technology. These ethics audit, as for example, offered by my company, Ethical Intelligence, will help you look at the technology, the algorithm that you are using, the sort of governance, see how it might impact certain people, and will help you make it more fair and hopefully help you raise the diversity in your team as well. That is it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and you may get in contact with me in all of these three for reaching out for questions or just in general. And I want to give one last little plug. If you are interested in knowing more about training workshops, we have one by Ethical Intelligence this afternoon, which is about the ethics of productivity measuring in the workplace. So if you want to know more about that, contact me and I'll send you a link. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. It was quite interesting and like really showing what AI can and cannot do. And I guess the gist of your message is that it's good to use AI, but you should know how to use what data you feed in and trust that data. And at the end, if that's not the case, at least make sure you do the audit of what you're doing so that you know and you're accountable. I think doing it responsibly or ethically is the key here. I think it's two-sided sword in that sense. All right. To everyone, if there are any questions, please post, but we will aim to take it towards the end. So in continuation to what Fiona mentioned, I would like to now introduce our second guest for today, Gino. Gino, are you there? Can I see you? Camera on?
I'm here.
Oh,
For the
somehow
camera, I'm not exactly sure. What? I can't like I could hide my video, but then there's not a thing for starting my video again. That's fun.
Okay. Maybe you log out and log in again or something.
Let's do so.
Yeah. While Gino comes back, I can quickly introduce him. So I think, as Fiona, you also mentioned, so AI is not magic. In my mind, AI is maths, it's mathematics. And our next speaker, Gino, is somebody who's an expert in maths or physics who loves data and graphs. So he's a data scientist, a physicist, and he works at MedMod in Sweden. He works as a data scientist consultant with a background in physics and complex systems. He's worked in healthcare, solar energy, and responsible AI. And Gino's biggest interests lie in causality, statistical methodology, algorithmic discrimination, and all that lies in between this broad topics. So welcome, Gino. Hopefully you are back or not yet, not.
Seems not quite yet, so we may need to wait a second until he's able to join. In the meantime, of course, if anyone has any questions for Fiona, we could take one at least.
Yeah, I guess while Gino comes back, at least I had a question, Fiona, and I could. So some of you had already sent the questions beforehand, so I already have that list of questions, and I had also moderated some questions. So I guess based on what you said, Fiona, and also the Amazon issue or the Amazon debacle, it is very clear that why many tech experts are worried that rather than removing human biases from important decisions, we are making the AI or enhancing the bias to the AI. But what can we do? What are the practical steps to kind of remove these biases so that we can still use the AI and get reap the low-hanging fruits or the benefits of it, like faster processing of data, faster processing of repetitive data, scanning of CVs, like nowadays with LinkedIn and all, I see that for one role, there are 200 applicants. It's impossible, humanly impossible for people to scan that many. So at least helping you scan the very basic stuff. But how can we try to do that? It does it without this bias or fed, that bias is not fed to it, because it's human feeding the data, human simulating the data. So I am sure that unknowingly we feed the bias to it. How can we try to balance it?
Well, I think this is the question that the industry is currently trying to solve. So unfortunately, I can't just hand you the solution. I can say a little bit about my personal recommendations is that there is technical solutions to mitigating bias in algorithms, and maybe Gino is going to go a little bit more into the sort of technical part of the where bias occurs in algorithms. There is certain libraries that help restrain an algorithm to saying, okay, you learn from our data, but we need you to give an equal amount of chance to, for example, both men and women, and you can restrain that. The sort of acceptance that the algorithm does goes 50-50 to both genders, but then you will have to feed it into all the groups that you're trying to consider, right? And so similarly, there's other sort of technical fixes to helping an algorithm not be as biased. There's big efforts to collecting more, how do I say, more diverse data and better data sets that aren't as heavily skewed. But from my work perspective, I'm going to say that it's really important to always do audits of the technology that you are using. Do not just look at them from the sort of technical perspective, but do take advice from social scientists, from humanities professionals who look at the algorithm from a more social perspective and say, okay, this is the decision that you're making, but at the point at where you're employing this algorithm, it's making these really big decisions that are giving unequal or unfair access to certain groups. And for example, the problem that we have with bias isn't necessarily that an algorithm works less for a small amount of people, because that's almost always the case. Anything that we develop will not equally work for all the people. The problem with AI algorithms is that that small group is always the same. Across all the different algorithms, it always hits the same group, which means that we are developing algorithms for one large majority, and we're always leaving out this one group that is already being left out historically in the events leading up to the AI algorithm, and that is the big problem. So we need to really work on distributing that more fairly and pay special attention to not always lay off the negative parts on that one group.
Yeah, I guess well said. And like you said, that it's not a one stick answer. There's no silver bullet to it. So I understand, but well said. And I think you said the solution lies also in the technicality of it, or how mathematically are those algorithms written. And with that, I take the lever off to Gino. Welcome, Gino. And you are a mathematician and physicist, a data scientist. So maybe you could take us through how do these algorithms really work, and how can we try to create better algorithms or feed in better data so that we make the best use of AI.
Yes.
Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to just make a quick comment about what Fiona just said, is that I totally agree that the problem with AI algorithm, one of the problem with the AI algorithms is that they are unfavorable to the same group consistently. And one nice way of putting it, I think, that I've heard before said by somebody, is that it's like as if having an AI algorithm taking all decisions is like having a slightly racist older uncle taking all the decisions. Maybe you don't want to do that. Anyway, that being said, let me share my screen or figure out how to do that. That will be this. Whoa. Okay. Now there's a zoom bar. Oh God, everything disappeared. Okay, I think I'm figuring it out as I go. No, there's a zoom thing right in front of my screen for some reason. Like options, and my computer is struggling. Very nice. Wow.
Is there a way that someone else can share it for you? Would that work?
Let's see like this. Do you see anything? Oh, wow. It's
Yeah, we see it.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I see, but my screen is like
You're sharing the whole window. I guess you need to.
No, I'm sharing. Am I? Well,
no, I think you're only sharing the one.
That was interesting. Let's try like this. It's just that every like 5 seconds, my screen was blacking, and so it is doing it right now and popping out of the presentation mode.
We can see your screen now. Is it okay for you?
Yes, please. That's bizarre. Never seen anything like this. Wow. Stop share. This doesn't count towards my 15 minutes, does it?
No.
I already have tight time.
Can you, Lotta, try sharing it, or Fiona, if you can? If not, then I will try.
I can share them if you want.
Yeah, I guess.
You have it on hand?
Yeah.
Fiona, you could share it. It would be good.
Yeah, Fiona, if you have it handy, then you can maybe share, and Gino can just talk.
Can I then have remote control? Like
Yeah, I
click,
think you can ask for control from Fiona
that'd be
once
nice.
she starts sharing.
Is that possible?
Let's see.
Yes, it is.
Okay, I don't know how that works. So
This is sabotage by Microsoft, I know.
So I'm sharing it now. I don't know how to give you. Oh, there's a remote control option. Is that the one?
Yeah, so at least.
Okay, try now. I think that should work.
Yeah.
Do you have control right now?
I'm controlling. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very nice. Okay, so my talk is going to be quite similar to Fiona's, although I think a bit complementary in that it's, yeah, not exactly the same. And what I hope you'll get from this is getting conceptual tools to navigate this topic of algorithmic discrimination a little bit better. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into what are the causes of discrimination and touch upon, but maybe more so in the discussion on how to mitigate them. And I hope that, yeah, that the quotation of Dr. Strangelove won't bring problems to this. Click, click, click. Too much clicks. Okay, so it's a bit, okay. So very shortly about me, I have not studied sociology or economics, I've studied physics, but those are the kind of, that's the environment in which I grew up, and the adults in my family had the background of sociology, physics, and economics. So that kind of explains why I'm interested in these topics of algorithmic discrimination and stuff like that. I work as a data science consultant, meaning that I build machine learning models. I work a lot with data day to day, and I have consulted also on the topic of algorithmic discrimination before. And I'm interested in quite tough, like causality, discrimination, explainability. So do reach out to me if you share that interest with me. And I like nature, as you can see in my picture, and I sing in choirs. I work at Medmod. It's a tiny consultancy firm here in Sweden. I clicked and nothing happened. Yeah. So first, a small disambiguation, because the word discrimination is used in very different ways. And so I hope that we don't get a problem with the Shakespeare trust for the quote. And this is the last quote, I hope, for the day. I clicked. I have to take control every time. So if you ask anybody out in the street what is discrimination, or if you ask a lawyer, they will pretty much give the same idea. Discrimination is the disadvantage brought about by a decision whereby a person is treated less favorably than someone else due to, and this disadvantage is due to sex, transgender identity, expression, ethnicity, so the discrimination grounds. And this is the definition of direct discrimination. Then there's other types of discrimination like indirect discrimination and so on. If you ask a machine learning scientist, what they will answer to you is this: you have some items, some of them are green, some of them are red. You can imagine that the status green-red is like dead, alive after an intervention, for example. And you want the algorithm to separate the green dots from the red dots as well as possible. So you can say that this algorithm is not so good at telling apart green dots from red dots because, okay, I didn't picture it, but say that above the line, we classify everything as green, and below the line, we classify everything as red. There are a lot of green dots under the line, misclassified, and there are there's a red dot above, which is also misclassified. So, and if you build a slightly better model, and I take control of the screen somehow. Yeah, there it is. This is better at telling apart the dots, and so machine learning scientists will say that this algorithm is more discriminative than the other one. In the sense, discrimination in the sense then of decision rules ability basically of telling apart examples or observations. And so when you put these two perspectives in a room and you tell a machine learning scientist, so I don't want your algorithm to discriminate, what do you think will happen? Well, this will happen. And it does happen. Like I have talked to data scientists that do not agree with, they say, no, but the machine learning should discriminate. That's what it's good at. And the reason that this fist fight happens is because we're talking about two different concepts. And so if you find yourself in that situation, just know that you're talking about two different things. So same thing, bias. What is bias? If you ask anybody out in the street, they will probably tell you it's, a preference I have. I have a bias towards, and that's what Fiona also said. Or in psychology, it's basically a fallacious thought process. It's kind of a bit badly said. And if you ask a machine learning scientist, they will think, aha, bias is when data misrepresents reality, which is kind of similar to a fallacious thought process in some sense. Then they will also think about a percentage of errors in the training set. And this might sound, okay, I'll get to that later. And then they will also think in classical statistical learning and statistical theory is the difference between an estimated property of observed population and the theoretical value that you should measure if there was no problem with the measurement process. And then another concept is a very, very detailed technical part of neural networks. So if you say bias, a machine learning scientist might think of all these things. And the problem, especially with the percentage of errors in a training set, is that it's related with a concept of that is called bias variance trade-off. In that, in machine learning, you always want to minimize the bias, that is the errors on the training set, but not at the expense of the variance, that is the errors on the validation set. So on a set that you don't use for training the machine learning. And so it is desirable in machine learning to have some bias, because if you have no bias, it means that you're overfitting on your training set and you have an algorithm that is very good at the data that you fed it, but it's not good at other data. So what happens when you say that machine learning shouldn't have bias? Well, this happens again. Okay, let's move on from the terminological. There's also some disambiguation to be done between fairness and non-discrimination, but I won't get into this. So let's get into the nitty-gritty details of the sources of algorithmic discrimination, and I will follow a paper by Suresh and Gupta. There will be a note down there about it. And in this context, we talk about discrimination in the sense of the law. So the sources of discrimination in the sense of the law, when algorithms discriminate according, like in the sense of the law. That was a lot of words for not a lot of content. So it starts there, it starts in the world. In the world, there's processes that generate data. And then generally we select part of the data to select the population. And then we measure some properties of the population. We process the data. And then maybe sometimes we get some data from other sources to validate a machine learning algorithm later. And then I click and nothing happens. Please. Great. And then you feed the training data into a model, you optimize some metrics, and you define the model, of course, and then you evaluate with the whole data set, usually. Then you apply the model in a real setting, and then you integrate it in the world. And then potentially this affects the world and affects the data generating. So the algorithm becomes part of the data generating processes, which is sometimes something that sometimes it's ignored and creates problems. It's called a feedback loop. You can see it because it's a loop. So where does bias enter in this picture? Basically everywhere. These like, so you can see historic biases are problems in the data generating processes in the world. Then there's selection bias, measurement bias, evaluation bias, aggregation bias, and these are just the biases that Suresh and Gutak described. There's others. All these question marks should symbolize that. And there's other arrows and boxes that are missing from here. For example, I had an example, it's gone. Well, yeah. So, and for example, they are missing a goal definition. They are missing assumptions. Okay, you can say it's in model definition. But so this is not the whole picture. There's more, but let's start here. Let's start with the historic. Now I'll give, oh, and one thing I would like to say is that all these boxes like selection, measurement process, these are basically socio-technical processes, and it should show that the machine learning is not created in a vacuum. It's created by social processes and by technical processes together. And while this is a positivist take on the sources of algorithmic bias, in that we try to like break it into smaller components, I think it's useful to think about biases in this way. But you will see that it's not always obvious to clearly separate the real reasons of discrimination, because these biases are often together. They appear together, like historic bias together with some kind of measurement bias. So now I will go through some examples. Some come like inspired by real world scenarios that I've heard of through the news, and some are just like thought experiments. To get some examples of these biases. So historic biases. Say that you want to build a machine learning model to estimate, before hiring somebody, you estimate how long they will, if you hire them, how long they will be staying as an employee. And this is desirable as an employer because you want to diminish churning. You want people to stay longer, basically. So we represent this. So you collect data, and the data looks like this. You have an outcome that is the observed length of stay for in the past at your company, and this length of stay is affected by some things. And it just so happens that historically, at your company, people have with a certain gender expression or sexual identity or whatever stay less because they are discriminated or because they don't feel comfortable there. What will happen is that if you feed that information to a machine learning algorithm, it will say, aha, the probability that this person will stay long is smaller for example, for this is opposite. It's smaller for males than for females, because my thought scenario was that in this company it's males that stay shorter. Anyway, then if you take this information and taking this information into account in your recruitment process, then also the probability that you will employ somebody will be dependent on the sex of the person. And this is when you explicitly have sex among the predictors in the machine learning algorithm. Then another example, say that I want to predict whether a candidate will click on a job ad. I have a job ad platform and I want to show relevant job ads to a candidate. Now, it just so happens that in this case also, the sex of the candidates will influence whether the candidate would click or not. And that's because historically, people know that, oh, this job is historically, for example, male dominated. So I won't even look at it. And then, well, the same thing happens. The algorithm will say that the probability of clicking is lower for females than for males. So say I want to be a bit smarter. I say I ignore that information. I ignore sex in the algorithm. I don't put it as a predictor. Instead, I would like to use information about other clicks, other job ads that this person has clicked on, which might be so that would be those dots that I added, which might be indicative of an unobserved interest. Like this person is interested in all these jobs, and therefore it clicks on these job ads. And then I use the other clicks to predict whether this person will click on this job ad or not. Is this okay? Maybe. It's not if sex also affects those other job ads that the person clicked or did not click on. So in this case, the algorithm will kind of reconstruct the sex, the influence of sex on the probability of clicking, and so it will be discriminatory. And then just a couple of more examples. Goal bias. Say that you want to estimate whether a person is extrovert or not, and you take this into account in the decision. But it just so happens that people with neuropsychiatric neuropsychiatrically diverse are less likely to be extroverted, and you don't really need, and for being good at the job, you don't really need to be extroverted. This is a case of indirect discrimination in that neuropsychiatric diversity will influence the decision. And then finally, automation bias. You have a situation in which you have a cheap algorithm, and so you are more likely to use it a lot to automate processes. But then, if you can't use the algorithm for some reason, like I don't know, the algorithm needs you to have a voice. It needs to analyze your voice, and you can't speak. And there's no way for you to continue in the process, in the HR process, without having a voice. Then you will be excluded automatically. So here's some interesting reads. I think I'll share my slides with you, so you can just read them up. And to sum up, I think you can say a little bit tongue-in-cheek that data is wrong, algorithms are wrong, world is wrong, but we can do a little bit better. And I look forward to talking about this in the discussion. Thank you a lot.
Thanks, Gino. That was quite intense. How algorithms and mathematics work. Not the easiest thing for a person like me to follow, but quite interesting, because I guess that's the basis of how decisions are made and how the AIs work. Moving on to questions, like I said, we already had some questions which were sent by people earlier, and some of them have come now. So maybe I'll take the first question, maybe to both of you. Could you please elaborate on the potential ethical issues of personality type analysis by AI? And here we are not talking of emotion recognition during video interview or something, but more of ethical issues of the personality type analysis by AI. Does it make sense? Do you follow it?
So maybe I can say a little bit about personality type tests in general. I don't know if it makes much of a difference if it's done by AI, unless we're taking it from a sort of video or voice file, as opposed to just administering the questions. But generally, personality types have been developed with a very Europe and Western centered audience in mind. And there's a lot of sort of questions that have a different cultural significance for someone from a different background, and that might be understood as very different. And things like being outgoing, polite, respectful, these differ in how they are displayed in like voice and tone and body position. If we are looking at a certain an AI that looks at your video and assigns you a personality test, but it also differs in how you would respond to a situation that you would think about yourself if you're filling out a question. So these personality type tests are by nature not necessarily generalizable across populations, and then therefore, if we're trying to find a diverse group of applicants, are a bit counter what we're trying to do.
Agree with you.
I would like to build on that even if you could theoretically, even if you could theoretically measure these things reliably, I think that the last example I brought up is relevant here, in that if you are basing your hiring decision, for example, on a certain personality trait, and that is not relevant for a job, you might risk indirectly discriminating people.
Yeah, agree. All right. Moving forward to the next question, it says, Finland does not have much research about discriminating aspect of AI-enabled recruitment. In fact, there seems to be a perception that advanced technology such as AI is very objective. What is your advice to address this? And maybe to this, I might also want to add something from my end, that should also organizations focus on transparent AI? Do they need to tell that what are we doing, or how are we doing the recruitment process? Or should there be even a law about transparent AI in recruitment?
So I'm going to just jump in here with a little bit of paperwork. So to say, I'm happy to say that the current draft of the EU regulations for AI classifies algorithms AI in hiring and recruitment as high risk, and it will therefore be under obligation of being transparent and being reported that there is AI happening, how it's happening, how decisions are made. And it will also be under the obligation to have a sort of risk management system in place around the governing of the algorithm. So that is something that I think is really good and important here. Generally, to borrow the words of the organization All Tech is Human, who are doing great work in the responsible AI community, we have a pipeline problem, which is that we have people who are interested and intrigued about ethical development of AI and want to do this process right, because they see that there is an advantage in algorithms, automation, and AI, but not the way that it's currently done. But we are not at the point that we have university courses, other education, that we have certifications, these certain things. They are not in place yet. So that's why right now a lot of the sort of focus is on the technical aspects, because we have AI master's degree, we have computer science, we have big infrastructure in place that is awarding funding to these projects, because everyone is seeing this potential in AI and seeing how rapidly it's developing from a technological perspective. And again, I'm gonna be repeating myself a little bit here. We need to develop a pipeline that also reliably brings in social scientists, psychologists, and people from different disciplines who have a different perspective on these things into the discussion, award them funding, and help them contribute to the process, because only like that, and not just pure technical advancement, are we going to be able to make these algorithms something that will actually help us in the way that we want them to.
Yeah, yeah. But do the organizations have the obligation to inform the candidate that they are using AI, or why they were rejected because the AI said they are not suitable? In EU, do they have that obligation?
So as far as I understood, so I am not a law scholar, but what I read out of the EU regulation proposition as it is right now, that will be the obligation that consumers or end users, client, applicants, they can request a certain decision, and this needs to be A, communicated that there is an algorithm in place, and B, communicated how decisions are made. And I want to kind of add on a little bit here too. If any company is using an algorithm by a third party and they're passing on data to that third party, they need to disclose this just by rights of GDPR at the moment already, if the data is being transferred and it's not an in-house algorithm.
Isn't there also a part, isn't it part also of GDPR that there's a right to knowing that the decision was taken algorithmically, automatically, and why? But again, I'm very much out of my scope here, but I think GDPR also covers that a little bit. And there's a bit of discussion among law scholars about what constitutes a right to discrimination. I think there was a very nice paper by Sandra Wachter that brought forth the idea that there should be a right to, not the right to discrimination, excuse me, a right to explanation, that there should be a right to explanation.
Okay. I think the next question is a little bit in a tangent of AI or machine learning. It's about robotic process automation. So they are asking, how would you differentiate biases and other diversity problems in RPA compared to AI ML? I don't know if any of you can take this.
I would take this if I can, very quickly. I would, because I'm a positivist, I would take the same approach as Suresh and Guttag, because it has it's a quite general way of organizing, information about how socio-technical artifacts are brought into the world, and the processes by which RPA solutions are generated are very similar to, they share a lot of socio-technical processes that machine learning also share. So you just adapt a little bit that picture that I showed, I would say. All right.
Understood. So it could be applied to it as well in the similar format. Yeah. I think the next question is more for Gino, for you. It says, like, we spoke about historical processes on bias, but then we still know that most of the research is still done in the Western world by Western researchers, and the data is also collected in the Western world, which means the data is also biased. So how do we fix this, like, chronic issue or a historic problem? I think it's also feeding into what, Fiona, you also mentioned, that organizations are striving for diversity, but if you feed in the existing data, which is not diverse, how are you going to achieve your diversity targets or KPIs that you wish to get? So is there a answer to this? I know it's not an easy answer, but still, that's the question. How do you fix the historic processes?
I honestly can't tell. It's a very open question in the community. Also, it is known. It has been said before that a lot of the research in machine learning ethics and even just ethics is very Western centric, and how to adopt these to other views, other world views that are. And I honestly don't know. Ask a philosopher.
Right. I think This is also something that is joked about a lot in psychology, saying that all psychology research only applies to first-year undergrads of US colleges. So, because that is usually the test subjects for all of these researchers, because they just send all the first years in because they get credits for it. I went through this process too. And I think a lot of it here has to do with convenience, right? That's the easiest way to get participants for your subjects. You don't need to pay them. You're saving a lot of money. And I think it goes similarly with the sort of data that is currently available. We have a bigger history of data infrastructure in the Western world with sort of research and these sort of things. So that's why there is a lot of more data available, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good data or that it's well archived data, or it's just there's a lot of it, and that's what machine learning algorithms need. So in my opinion, we have to move a little bit from what's easy and accessible to what is right, and I'm being optimistic here, obviously. But expanding the sort of research processes that are conducted in other parts of the world and connecting these databases with one another. Mm. But again, I'm also not a data or like a quantitative researcher. So
if I could expand also on my previous comment, I think that in principle, what to do about these problems is quite, in some ways, it can be independent of your your ethical frame of reference. If you have a method that is separate from the ethical frame of reference, a systematic way of approaching these kind of problems, like Suresh-Ngutags, then you can adapt the tool to the ethical frame of reference. So that's my hope, that using systematic processes to address these questions gives everyone across the world a way of addressing them and suit their needs, their ethical and their ethical requirements, and adapt them also to different legislation. I mentioned, for example, Swedish discrimination law. It's different from US discrimination law. It's different from European even, and from other jurisdictions discrimination law. And I think if you have systematic processes to take these requirements, these legal requirements, these ethical requirements into account in the way you design AI and algorithms, then it doesn't. Then you can kind of adapt your AI to the current situation in which you want to use the AI, and not US standards by default, for example.
Yeah. Maybe it's also maybe how far you use AI in recruitment in the process. Like I have a practical example. I had an ex-colleague who was a recruiter, and she had like 10 CVs to be scanned in a day. And the requirement was that she needs a Norwegian-speaking Java developer. So what she did is that, okay, 10 CVs, she immediately removed all the foreign named CVs, assuming they don't speak Norwegian. Well, many did there, but she assumed it. And then she said, okay, now there are 5 left, 2 females, 3 males. Maybe men are better in coding. It's a Java development. So, okay, these 3 are invited for interview. That was a quick fix thing she did because she was constrained on time. So it was not her, okay, it was her some unconscious, conscious bias, but it was also the time constraint. Maybe in these kind of things, AI can do justice that, okay, it is at least helping you scan the CVs and suggest what are the most qualified CVs of the 10, rather than discriminating on the language or the gender. So maybe in the initial stages it can work, or what's your feeling?
Fiona?
So I think it's a funny example because it plays in what I mentioned earlier. Time is a big issue for humans, that if we are not given time, we're going to go with our gut feelings. We're going to go with the heaviest stereotypes. And often we know, your colleague that probably knew that, she's stereotyping here, and that she's probably not doing justice to people. But that's what we do because the sort of unconscious bias and stereotyping is less energy consuming and it goes quicker. And we know that. Now, would an AI have done better here? I can't tell. It depends very much on the data that it's been trained with and the way that it's engineered. As I said, there's constraints that can make it a little bit more equitable between the different groups. But I want to say one thing, and that is CVs are self-reporting and they're words. So it's really difficult to tell whether or not someone is a good Java developer or not from maybe a little bar that they indicated how fluent they are at a programming language. And similarly, I can't tell what language someone speaks by looking at them. I can't tell what language someone speaks by just looking at their CV, because there might be some indicators about where they went to school or maybe, where they're born, but that won't apply to everyone. And in my opinion, these are some things that neither we nor an algorithm can mind read. And to know what language someone speaks, you need to ask them. You will need to ask them the question, what language do you speak?
Yeah.
That would be also my answer, is that you don't need AI to avoid discrimination in this particular case. You just need to ask the right questions. Yeah. And at least I think that a good way of addressing a lot of problems with AI discrimination and so on is to do away with the AI. If you can achieve a goal without using AI, do that by all means.
But then I would like to challenge that thinking also, because then comes in the diversity question, because like we have seen in the Silicon Valley, they used to have, at least back in 80s, 90s, like this bro culture, or high like this techies nerds, recruiting techies nerds, because they felt they could do a better coding or better job. There was always this feeling that people who think alike, look alike, have similar hobbies, it's better to work with them rather than getting somebody completely diverse, or a person like me from India. I don't know. So I'm just asking that there, if you would talking to people, and people sitting and recruiting and talking, they would still get a unconscious or conscious bias that no, still this is a preferred candidate because he's a white man and he can code and he also plays soccer. Just an example. So wouldn't AI play a good role there, that it will help you at least screen off those biases and give you something which is neutral?
In the end, you will still have a human taking a decision. So no, I wouldn't think so. No. And okay. Also, it can help, but my point was that it might not be necessary. And if it's not necessary, then you might as well do away with it.
Okay.
Maybe if I can chime in.
You don't promote the merit of AI in recruitment, in a nutshell, then.
No.
I'm going to maybe give a little bit more differential perspective, if that helps. I think that we need to remember that hiring isn't a sort of one stage process, right? Many hiring processes start with finding an applicant pool that in many cases isn't diverse enough. So we have a part here, then we are pre-screening applicants that applied maybe for some hard set criteria that we just need them to be over 18 because we can't employ anyone under 18, or we need them to have this degree for legal requirements, or whatever it may be, right? And then a little bit more fine-grained search of screening of, okay, after we've sorted out those that we just cannot hire, then maybe who might be better. And then you often have an interview stage, right? So there's several stages. And I do think that there is a place for AI in some of these stages and not necessarily in the others. So the sort of like pre-screening of, hey, we ask people what's their age and we need them to speak this language. We ask them what languages they speak. Then you can very safely take an algorithm and just say, okay, whoever indicated they don't speak this language, we're going to sort them out because we need them to speak this language. And that is a very easy algorithmic thing to do. That's a simple if statement in an Excel spreadsheet, really. And I think that is a great place to save time. Similarly, for finding diverse applicant pools, you can equip AI search with keywords and algorithms that will find you certain groups that have maybe more diverse people in them. For example, there is women in AI, Black in AI, right? Those are big communities that are gathering these sort of people that you might want to reach out to if you're, recruiting for a tech job. And an AI can help you find A, those groups, B, people within those groups that might match certain keywords that you give them. And we have to be careful with keywords here, obviously, as well. But I think those are great places that the AI isn't necessarily making a life or death decision, but it can help you save a lot of time, and it can help you broaden your applicant pool and making those matches. And then on a later stage where it's about the sort of assessing the skills of an applicant, then I think there's a very good sort of methods in human recruiting, like evidence-based recruiting, and there's diversity, equity, and inclusion methods that I'm not an expert on, but that you can learn and employ that help make humans make less biased decisions. And I think that would be a stage of the recruitment process where those should be more prevalent.
Right. So
I totally agree. And I hope that my comment didn't come off as you shouldn't use AI. It's just you should use it mindfully. And for example, the first thing that Fiona mentioned, that you can use an if statement, that's not AI. And that's what I meant. If you can use a very simple tool, use that. Don't use AI, because it's easy, it costs less, and so on.
Yeah, and then you know what's happening in there. It's not like you're relying just on the machines to tell this is your star candidate.
Yeah, and also the other very good thing that Fiona said, other among many, I just really like what Fiona says all the time, so I'm is that like the example of keyword augmentation. You have a set of keywords and you want to identify candidates based on those keywords, but you know, they might have misspelled, they might have used synonyms, acronyms. There, for augmentation, can AI help in the sense that it's not, and why is that good? Because it doesn't exclude, it includes more. So if you use AI for inclusion, it's a big win.
Agree. And I think it also might be relevant for niche skills or some specific skills which you do not regularly find from your regular sources, LinkedIn or Monster, or where you find people. Maybe you could then use, there are web crawlers or something who's really going and searching with those keywords with the niche skills. But yeah, again, it has to be done objectively, that do you get the right outcome. Right. I have one more question. And there is also somebody who's raised their hand, so she might want to ask personally. But before that, I take the first question. Isn't a process that uses categorical information about people inherently biased, and therefore the problem of using AI is outsourcing the responsibility of your biases and replacing it with a uniform bias given by a unique entity, which is AI in this case?
I think there's two answers to this. One is the sort of machine learning answer that I'm going to leave to Gino. But generally, yes, categories, boxes will always be biased because you are kind of defining a center of a box and then squeezing some people in, even though they might be more towards the edge or outside of the box naturally. I think important here to remember is AI biases aren't always like human biases. Because human biases have a lot to do with sort of emotions. There's not just kind of our implicit attitudes about how we feel about a certain ethnicity, but there's also biases about we prefer tall people, we prefer people that we think are pretty, we prefer people that we connect to, you know, what Shirley was mentioning, the sort of culture aspect of a lot of hiring decisions are basically just we prefer hiring those people that we like. And AI won't do that. There's other biases that AI is sort of getting at, and that are also to some extent intended, as Gina mentioned. But again, as I mentioned earlier, here the problem is mainly that it's always the same group of people that falls outside of the categories, and that isn't being considered. Okay.
Francisca, you wanted to ask?
I also wanted to add a little bit, is that
please.
On top of on top of human biases, algorithms add their own special set of biases that was in the Suresh and Guttag's picture, like biases that come from the fact that, and that's, I didn't explain it well enough, but data misrepresents the world. Even if the world was fair, very often it does misrepresent the world, and it's a very known fact of statistics and science. And it has many names. It has, you know, confounding. It has selection bias. You know, so it's not just substituting our biases. It's adding some new ones and making it automated, making it on a large scale and faster. So, and adding some more.
Yeah. So it's an imperfect world, we all know, and we have those imperfections which we feed the machines. Then that's what they're going to do. It's human simulating the machine. So whatever we know, we don't know, that's what we teach them, right? Franziska, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. And hello, Gino, nice to see you again. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about solution or problem solving here. Because of course there are these biases, and the biases have a lot to do with categories. And you've already talked a bit how categories misrepresent the world, but categories also always create the world. So as a concrete example, for example, HireVue, the software used in online assessments. I recently was objected to one of these tests, and I received the results of the AI analysis of my personality. And I was put into categories. For example, the system thought that I had an experimental way of working, which is not true. And there was no way from a community perspective to correct these categories. And I was wondering, even if the EU regulation one day maybe regulates hiring processes and the use of AI in these processes, if there's any chance from the side of the companies using these technologies to build in a community approach. With that, I mean, would it be possible and desirable for companies, for example, to give applicants the chance to correct the categories that they are put into? Even if we know categories are, well, they are social and culturally constructed, they reproduce power relations, but if we won't get rid of AI in hiring, I think, because it's too convenient in many instances, but at least build in kind of a loop to include applicants or to include the end users into the processes more. Do you see any technical opportunities to do that, to give the applicant the opportunity, okay, this is how we categorized you. Do you want to make any changes to this?
Gino, do you want to?
No, you go first.
All right. I think this is less of a technical challenge than a sort of AI governance challenge. There is no technical problem in doing any of this. I can maybe speak a little bit to why I believe that companies aren't currently doing it is categories aren't value neutral. We would hope they are. We would hope that someone who's hiring for a job looks at the different categories and says, okay, for this job, we would need someone who's maybe more introverted. We don't need them to speak to a lot of people. We just need them to focus on their task, right? We would hope that that's the case. But unfortunately, there is this sort of perspective that a certain type of personality, a certain type of people, often the extroverted, outspoken one, charismatic ones, you know, that's the one that we want for all the jobs. Even though that's not necessary, as Gino mentioned in his example, extraversion for some tasks is not necessary, and it will end discriminating. So because we have this idea of what should be the ideal personality, then people might or will be correcting categories that the AI is assessing them towards what they believe is optimal. And right now, since companies are probably using them for this one good personality type, they don't want that, because that one good personality type is rather predictable, and they know that you know it, and they know that you will correct your own judgments towards what you think they think is good. And since that is kind of what they're using at the moment as well, I don't think they will allow this. Now, the ideal obviously is that we have a better understanding of the sort of skills that someone needs, and not necessarily the personality. Some personality traits are connected to skills, and sometimes you need a certain personality. You know, if you were hiring a public speaker, maybe it's good you're hiring someone outgoing and charismatic, you know, who likes to do small talk after the rounds or whatever. But that we are making a distinction between, okay, this job does not need an outspoken person, this job doesn't need a charismatic person, that we're making room for neurodiverse people who you know might not present this what we call the optimal personality, and that then people would be able to correct what they believe they are more like, because there isn't one right answer to it, right? And I think that kind of it all chains together if we have this more nuanced approach to hiring. If we look at personality, and there isn't one right answer, then maybe there is a way for people to veto, and maybe that might not necessarily be, hey, I want to change my noting, but rather saying, hey, here I perceive that the algorithm is wrong, and maybe that feeds into the algorithm training over a period of time.
Thank you.
I totally agree with everything, of course, as always. And I would like also to mention that there has been a lot of suggestions on what we can do to solve these problems. And okay, two things. One, there has been a lot of suggestions. It's not really clear how well they work, but you know, it's worth exploring them. For example, and here I'm borrowing from a paper by Michele Eloy, who's a philosopher in Switzerland, who wrote a paper for Algorithm Watch, where he summarized a paper about a paper explicitly about AI in HR. So, and it's in my slides. So please go have a look. But there he documents 4 categories of socio-technical ways of mitigating problems. And there's, for example, you document the bias in the data. There are some technical and socio-technical ways to address that. And then you improve the fairness of outcomes. Again, there's technical, socio-technical approaches. There's a lot, and there's another paper also by Luciano Floridi, who has summarized a lot of these ways of mitigating biases. Then you are transparent about what you do, what you like, what is your goal, how you try to mitigate discrimination, you know. And then there's also like inclusive R&D, inclusive design of algorithms, participatory design, and that kind of approach. So there's a lot of things. There's not just, you know, the technical approach of people giving a feedback to the algorithm. So there's much that can be done, I think.
Yeah. All right. I guess being conscious of the time, we are on the top of the hour. I would like to conclude this, and this will be anyways on YouTube as well. We will also post the video on the LinkedIn pages. So I think the discussion can continue still offline if there are any more questions. But I guess to sum it up, I would say that we need to remember what AI is good at: processing large amount of data, finding keywords, finding or reading into CVs like languages, skills, degrees or stuff, or doing good for repetitive high volume tasks. But we also need to remember AI cannot do magic, and it will not be able to identify things which we humans couldn't identify. I guess I'm just made notes of what we discussed. So I think it's important that we remain accountable. What are the decisions made? Did we understand how are they made? And if in doubt, like Fiona, you said, do an ethics audit for the technology that you are using. I think the aim should be to harness the great advantages of AI that it can bring, but still making sure that the deployment happens ethically and responsibly. So I think with this note, I would like to close. And thank you, everyone, for a wonderful presentation and conversation. And yes, please send the questions still if you have any. We'll try to take it offline. We'll share the material, and this video will be also shared. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vaishali, also for moderating.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.